네, 안녕하세요. 네, 성균관대학교 문철우입니다. 오늘 NAB 주최 임팩트 북콘서트를 시작하겠습니다. Hello everybody. This is a book concert to celebrate Korean translation version of Impact, written by Sir Ronald Cohen. 네, 오늘 늦은 시간인데 이렇게 여러분들 많이 참석해 주셔서 너무 감사합니다. 예, 지금부터 우선 저자 소개, Sir Ronald 코헨경의 소개 영상을 간단히 보시겠습니다.
It's a great pleasure for me to join you in Korea at this event organized by the National Advisory Board of the GSG. And I want to take the opportunity to share some thoughts with you following the publication of the G7 Impact Task Force report, which Korea played a role in preparing. I'm very proud to say. We can no longer deny the challenge that we face in terms of climate change, nor the social tensions that inequality is creating across the world. For a long time, many people thought that these consequences stemmed from our political system. But we're now beginning to realize that it is companies that create pollution, not governments in the main, and that the social issues very often stem from lack of employment opportunity. And that too is something that companies are responsible for in great part. And so the task force report highlights the huge importance today, if we want to tackle our climate and our social challenges effectively, of changing the behavior of companies. And the lever that it identifies is the lever of transparency. Because huge flows of capital, $40 trillion worth of ESG investment, are currently going to achieve impact as well as profit. And companies are beginning to see investors rebel against some of the impacts, the negative impacts they're creating. We saw last year the Procter & Gamble shareholders meeting witness a protest against management's deforestation, which comes from the use of palm oil. And we've seen the board of ExxonMobil forced by shareholders to kick off 3 directors and appoint 3 new ones who know more about environmental issues. This trend is unstoppable now because the climate and the social pressures on us are not going to go away if we don't change our economic system. And the power of investors and the power of consumers who don't want to buy products from companies that are creating harm and don't want to work for them, the power of talent as well, are all pushing companies to change their behavior so that they deliver risk, return, and impact. Just making money without worrying about the negative consequences you create is becoming a dirty phrase. So how do we achieve transparency on impacts? When we see a huge number of people protesting now about greenwashing, with investors complaining that their intention to create impact is not translating into action. It's in fact translating into marketing messages very often. And the answer is that the world has changed so much in terms of technology and big data that we are able today to measure the impacts that companies create and to give them a monetary value. We can measure the impact a company creates from its operations on the environment, from its employment on people, and from its product on people and planet. And an effort that the GSG initiated with the Impact Management Project at Harvard Business School, the IWA, the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative, has published thousands of companies' environmental and employment impacts in monetary terms today. And soon product impacts will also be published, and in the second quarter of this year, supply chain impact too. The message from this is going to be that the insights investors gain from the monetary valuation of impact will make regulators mandate the publication of impact-weighted accounts. I believe this process will take just 2 or 3 years now. We've seen the establishment of a standards board to cover the whole world, apart from the United States. It was announced at COP26. Standardized measures of tons of carbon and liters of water, of physical measures are going to be established. And the next step is standardized valuation of these quantities so as to bring impacts to the core of our investment and our business decisions. Adam Smith famously coined the phrase, the invisible heart of markets. The invisible hand of markets, forgive me. Impact is the invisible heart of markets that guides their invisible hand. Thank you.
네, 여러분들 코헨경의 저자, 코헨경의 스피치 잘 들으셨죠? 우리 코헨경도 여기 오늘 온라인으로 모셨는데요. 모두 박수 한번 주시죠, 크게. Thank you so much, Sir Ronnie, for making additional efforts to give us the insights about your book and your thoughts on this. We very much appreciate your time and contributions to this webinar very much. Now, 여러분들 오늘 저희 코헨경과 임팩트 북콘서트, 제가 이 책을 다시 한번 보여드리겠습니다. 임팩트라는 책의 북콘서트인데요. 원래 영어로 써져 있었는데 지금 이제 국어로 최근에 번역돼서 이제 시중에서 팔리고 있습니다. 그리고 우리 코헨경께서는 조금 전에 저자 소개에서 보셨겠지만 임팩트 투자 그리고 임팩트 개념을 전 세계적으로 최초로 어떻게 보면은 이 개념화시킨 그런 분이시죠. 예, 그래서 너무나 유명하시고 저희가 존경을 많이 하고 계신 그런 분이십니다. 오늘 코헨경을 모시고 이제 저희가 이 책의 출간과 관련해서 임팩트가 뭐냐, 임팩트 투자가 뭐냐, 그리고 요새 ESG 또 얘기를 많이 하고 있는데 이런 얘기를 우리 한국의 젊은 청년들과 같이 하는 그런 시간을 갖겠습니다. 예, 우선 근데 이제 제가 오늘 이 웨비나를 준비하다 보니까 이 도대체 임팩트가 뭐냐 이걸 참 생경하게 받아들이시는 분들 많고 임팩트 투자는 뭐냐 이렇게 말씀하시는 분 많은데 조금 전에 우리 Sir Ronald께서 설명하신 것 같이 돈만 버는 회사가 아니고 그 회사들이 환경 문제와 사회 문제, 사회 양극화 문제를 너무 많이 일으켰기 때문에 그 문제들을 해결을 해야 되는데 그 문제들을 어떻게 해결할 것인가? 그 이슈에 있어서 민간 자금이 기업에 투자가 되는 과정에서 임팩트를 보고 투자하는, 그리고 수익성을 포기하느냐? 그렇지 않습니다. 수익성도 보지만 임팩트를 보고 투자하는 이런 것이 돼야 되고, 이것이 최근에 우리 코헨경이 말씀하셨지만 작년에 영국의 21년에 있었던 영국의 G7 정상회의에서 이 임팩트 투자를 강조하는 임팩트 태스크포스가 발족됐습니다. 그래서 G7 임팩트 태스크포스가 생겨나서 거기에서 G7 정상들과 또 우리나라도 참여했습니다마는 모두들 자 이제 임팩트 경영과 임팩트 투자가 활성화되기 위해서 뭐가 이루어지는가 거기에 대해서 논의를 하면서 강조를 한 게 트랜스페런시, 즉 과연 내가 진정성 있게 임팩트 경영을 하고 있는 회사인가를 객관적으로 과학적으로 보여주고 투명하게 보여주는 이 트랜스페런시가 중요하다라는데 다 G7 정상들이 합의를 했죠. 그리고 그것을 앞으로 계속 지속적으로 우리가 노력을 같이 하기로 했습니다. 그 트랜스페런시가 조금 전에 코헨경께서 말씀 주셨듯이 결국 회사가 돈을 번 것을 회계장부에 발표를 하고 하지만 그것은 주주의 입장에서 얼마나 돈을 벌었냐만 발표를 했는데 주주 이외에 우리 제품과 우리가 또 환경 문제를 어떻게 일으켰는가, 제품이 소비자들에 어떤 영향을 미치는가, 이런 전반적인 임팩트를 담아서 그래서 이제 회계장부도 새로 변화시키자 이런 움직임을 말씀을 주셨습니다. 자, 이런 간단한 좀 인트로 말씀을 드렸고요. 오늘 패널부터 먼저 좀 소개를 간단히 드리고 그리고 토론을 하겠습니다. 제가 우선 오늘 패널과의 토론을 저희가 한 30분 정도 예상하고 그 이후에는 이제 온라인으로 여러분들이 줌 채팅창, 그 다음에 유튜브로 지금 들어오신 분들이 많으신데요. 유튜브 채팅창에서 질문을 해주시면은 우리가 또 답변을 해드리도록 하겠습니다. Just a quick note to participants whose language is not Korean. So we'll have a 30-minute panel discussion with Sir Ronald, to be followed by open question and answer session, another 30 minutes. And please feel free to write down your questions either in English or in Korean on your chat chat lines. Then I'm going to collect all those questions and deliver those questions to Sir Ronnie so that we can do open question and answer session. So now let me introduce our panel. 우리 패널부터 좀 소개드리겠습니다. 먼저 제 오른쪽에 계신 심상달 교수님 지금 계신데요. 저희 심상달 교수님은 저와 함께 이번 이 임팩트 책을 이제 번역하시는 그 출판 과정에서 이제 감수를 같이 하셨던 교수님이시고요. 지금 카이스트와 한동대에서 사회적 경제 그다음에 임팩트 투자를 강의해 주시고 계시고요. 그 옆에는 우리 김영경 상무님인데요. D3 주빌리 파트너스에서 임팩트 투자를 하고 계십니다. 예, 근데 우리 김영경 상무님께서는요, 원래는 임팩트 투자 이쪽에 계시지 않다가 최근에 전향하신 분입니다. So Ronnie, I'm telling to the audience that Eunice Kim, she used to be an IB equity investment analyst at Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. Now she is converted impact investor. Now she's running one of these impact funds, and I'm delighted to have her here to have conversation with you. Now, moving on to next, my friend and my student Tendai. Tendai is from Zimbabwe. And she's one of our students in South Korean University, and she's in fact a diplomat from Zimbabwe, and she has a lot of these African-related impact investing issues that she wants to address with you. Moving on, next, 우리 경희대 경영학과에서 지금 공부하고 계시는 이다은 학생이시죠? 예, 그리고 SEN이라는 she's a social enterprise network, student social enterprise network SEN's representative here, and she's an undergrad student majoring in business. Now moving on, 우리 공민영 학생님, 공민영 학생은 지금 한양대에서 social innovation 를 공부하고 있습니다. She's studying social innovation in Hanyang University, and she has lots of questions about impact investing. I've been grilled by her, asking different, very difficult questions, and I think, Sir Ronnie, it is your turn to answer for further questions. Now, 다시 이제 주제로 들어와서 우리 이제 동영상도 보시고 또 책도 조금 읽으셨죠? 오늘 발표하시러 토론하시러 왔었는데 우리 첫 번째 질문 누가 먼저 하실까? 우리 Eunice, you have Yeah, Eunice will have our first question, and she promised that will be a very orthodox, very hardcore question.
Hi, Ronnie. Good morning.
Hi. Good morning.
저는 좀 철학적인 질문이 될 수도 있고, 임팩트 혁명에 대한, 임팩트 투자에 대한 일반 대중들의 인식 개선에 대해서 코헨경께 여쭤보려고 합니다. 사실은 이 질문은 제가 임팩트 벤처 캐피탈리스트로서 굉장히 많이 받는 질문이기도 하고요. 저도 매일매일까지는 아니지만 굉장히 자주 저 자신에게 던져보는 질문입니다. 이 책을 보면은 코헨경께서는 이제 What kind of world do we want to live in? 이라고 계속 말씀을 많이 하세요. 그러니까 결국 어떤 세상에 우리가 살고 싶냐 하면 이상주의적으로 생각하면 모두 다 평화롭고 돈을 놓고 우리가 다투지 않고 모두 잘 사는 걸 원하죠. 근데 사실 실상은 인간은 굉장히 이기적이기 때문에 이런 임팩트 혁명이나 임팩트 투자에 관련된 개념들을 받아들이기가 쉽지가 않아요. 물론 코헨경께서는 책에 이제 우리 투자자들이나 아니면은 자선가 그다음에 뭐 여러 이런 뭐 그러니까는 이해 관계자들에 대해서 말씀하셨지만 사실은 이 임팩트 혁명, 임팩트 투자, ESG 이런 것들이 정말로 힘을 발휘하려면 많은 대중들이 여기에 대해 설득을 당해야 되는데 인간의 본성이 이기적인데 이기적인 인간이 어떻게 세상을 위해서 좋은 일을 할 수 있을지 이제 이런 부분들에 대한 고민이 굉장히 커요. 저도. 그래서 아마 코헨경께서도 이런 질문 많이 받으셨을 것 같은데 이 부분 어떻게 생각하시는지 임팩트 혁명, 임팩트 투자에 대한 일반 대중들의 인식 개선에 대해서 질문드리겠습니다.
So, Sir Ronald, if I may translate briefly, what Eunice is asking as an impact venture capitalist. Now, as I told you, she is now being converted. I think she is converted. The impact revolution requires common people's acceptance of the idea of impact. But she finds the idea of impact is somewhat counterfactual to human nature, who tend to be seeking self-interest by and large. So how do we make these common people with self-interested tendency to embrace impact ideas? She has been struggling with that idea as an, turnaround impact venture capitalist nowadays. You have any answers for that?
Hi, Eunice, and still, Professor Moon, may I thank you very much indeed for all the efforts that you and NAB have taken to bring us all together. So, what we see today, Eunice, can you hear me through?
Yes, excellent. Yeah, we hear
Can
you.
you all hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Hello?
Yeah, we hear you very well.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you as well. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, because I don't hear myself back here. Okay, so what we see happening, Eunice, is a change in values today that defines people's self-interest a lot more widely than previously. We find consumers who are not buying products of companies that are polluting or that are using child labor. This has happened on a massive scale, and investors have become aware of it. And so investors now are directing $40 trillion in ESG to achieving impact as well as profit. So I think people are redefining self-interest in ways that we haven't seen previously. Now, when you say the impact revolution depends on popular support for it, it's partly true, but it isn't the whole story. Popular support means consumers and talent not wanting to work for companies doing harm, of course. But the real driver of this impact revolution now is investors. It's the $40 trillion which are beginning to change the valuation of companies on the stock exchange according to whether or not they are polluting more than their competitors. It's the shareholder meeting rebellions that I referred to in my initial comments. And what we see today is that the combined force of consumers, of talent, and of investors is beginning to make governments aware of the fact that pollution and social issues don't just stem from governments, they stem from businesses. And so governments are going to find themselves, because of these pressures, most recently from investors, having to regulate the transparency on the impacts that companies create. And they will need to do this because a disorderly market exists now, where some investors get impact data, which is proved to be price sensitive, and others don't. This is why we have seen the announcement of the establishment of a new Sustainability Standards Board by the IFRS, which is responsible for financial accounting across the whole world, except for the USA. So our system is changing before our eyes. And I just participated in a webinar to Australia with impact entrepreneurs whose business models today, out of self-interest as well as idealism, are going to risk return and impact, because it is a higher calling, it is a higher purpose, and it appeals to consumers and to talent and to investors. And when you look at a company like Tesla, you could have said that the self-interest of consumers is to buy existing cars. And yet we see Tesla valued at $1 trillion today. So I think our perceptions of self-interest have changed, and this change in values is meeting changes in technology and changes in transparency on impact to shift our whole economic paradigm. So don't despair. Persevere as a impact VC. Look for inspirational entrepreneurs with huge ambition to bring impact to their business model, so that the more impact they deliver, the more positive impact they deliver, the more profit and value they create.
Thank you, Sir Ronnie. Yes. 잘 질문이 답변이 되신 것 같죠. 예, 지금 여러분들 자막이 밑에 지금 실시간으로 국어로 지금 나오고 있습니다. 그래서 Sir Ronnie가 말씀하시는 거 잘 들으실 수 있을 것 같습니다. 예, 그래서 이 투자자들의 역할이 중요하고요, 그죠? 예, 그리고 고객들
마이크 안 들립니다.
아, 예, 마이크 들리나요 지금? 예. 예. 그래서 우리 서로아니께서 말씀하셨듯이 예, 이 일반적인 인식의 변화, 일반적인 인식의 변화라는 것을 이제 만들어내는 과정에 있어서 투자자들 역할 중요하고 결국 고객들의 인식 변화, 그다음에 이 우수한 인재들의 인식 변화 이런 것들을 바꿀 수 있는 것들이 투자와 그다음에 임팩트 안트로프너들 이런 분들의 역할을 통해서 만들어낼 수 있는 일이다. 이것이 가만히 있어서 변화가 되는 게 아니고 같이 창출될 수 있는 일이다. 내재 변수다. 쉽게 말하면 이런 말씀입니다. 자, 다음 또 우리 패널 여쭤보겠습니다. 우리 let me turn to Minyoung Go from Hanyang University, and she is an undergrad majoring in very difficult discipline, social innovation. Now she has a question for you. Yeah.
그럼 일단 한글로 먼저 제가 질문을 정리를 하면, 일단 오늘 이 자리는 코헨경께서 저희 한국의 젊은이들, 그러니까 아까도 투자자, 소비자로서의 그 사람들의 역할이 중요하다고 했는데, 사실상 이제 임팩트라는 책을 읽어보면 이 앞으로의 이 임팩트 혁명에 있어서 청년들의 역할을 되게 중요하게 생각하고 계신 것 같아요. 그래서 그 코헨경이 바라보는 청년들은 어떤 존재인지가 제가 궁금해서 그 부분에 대해서 질문을 드리려고 합니다.
So, Sir Ronald, today is a meeting between you and Korean young people mostly. young, ambitious, audacious, new entrepreneurs to come, right? And what are your views about these young people in impact revolution? What are their roles? What do you expect? What are your hopes? Please.
Good. Are you translating what I'm saying? Should I pause every so often?
No, we are simultaneously writing down your sentences as in transcriptions. So do not worry. Yes, subtitles. Yes.
Thank you. So I believe young people started this revolution and will lead it. And in that respect, it's very similar to the tech revolution. The change in values started with younger people, not with the older generations. They were the ones who refused to buy certain products or to work for certain companies. And today, it's the younger people, although there are some exceptions like Elon Musk, who is young at heart but older in age. The young people are the ones imagining new fintech models to bring finance to the most vulnerable, or fintech platforms to help the more vulnerable to manage their budget, or in the field of health, bringing telemedicine in ways we could never previously do to very far-flung places, or in education. It's young people inventing new educational models where the student pays for the education after they have been successful at it and got into a job and started to earn money. So we are beginning to see technology and impact coming together in the hands and brains of young people who are disrupting industries. Take Tesla as an example. Who would have thought that in 20 years you could build an automobile company worth $1 trillion, which would change the whole of the automobile industry away from the combustion engine to electric vehicles? We're going to see that happening in every sector where significant negative impact is being delivered by an existing business model.
Thank you, Sir Ronnie. Yes. Now, shall we move to Tendai's question? Tendai, again.
마이크 안 들립니다.
들립니까? 지금? 들리세요? 아, 마이크가 안 들린다 그러네요.
네, 들려요.
아, 들리는군요. 예. Now let me move to Tendai from Zimbabwe, working on her studies on social economy. So what are your thoughts after reading? What are your questions to Sir Ronnie?
Thank you so much. Turn it up. Can you hear me now? Is it clear?
Is that working? Is the mic working fine? Can you hear, Sir Ronnie?
Not really, no.
Okay. It's an absolute pleasure, Sir Cohen, to be able to ask you some questions and gain some understanding. My question was mainly around how homegrown solutions are boosting SMEs. I followed a discussion from last year's GSG summit that spoke about Ghana and Zambia. And I followed closely when Hamdia, Raphael, Joel, and Yuan were explaining challenges that Africa is facing regarding the funding of SMEs. Hamdia did mention that the discussions have been ongoing and that there's been a lack of catalytical funding. Yuan also mentioned that there's need for network sharing. My question is, where are we? What's the missing link? What is preventing capital from flowing into Africa and funding these SMEs?
So I'm hopeful that impact will act as a major incentive for investment into emerging countries and needy areas like SMEs, which account for the majority of employment in emerging countries. One of the striking developments in the last year is in the area of the bond market. I know it applies to bigger companies, but bear with me, I will bring it to SMEs. So, to my surprise and to the surprise of everyone else, sustainability-linked bonds and loans, where the rate of interest falls if you achieve a specific objective, environmental or social, reached $1 trillion from virtually nothing the year before. This shows that investors are prepared to accept, in some circumstances, a lower rate of interest for the achievement of impact. Now, the big challenge in Africa has been the absence of equity funding forever. There's an absence of debt funding too, but debt funding is more plentiful than equity. And I believe now that we see the growth of financial instruments of the kind I have described, that we can hope to attract funding from the private sector for the development of the SME sector. Now, as the G7 Impact Task Force report, which I referred to in my recorded comments, says, we need mechanisms to improve the risk-return impact balance there. We may need guarantees in some cases. I certainly believe that transparency on impact, the measurement of impact, will create a natural incentive for companies to sell more to emerging countries and invest more in them, because it will reflect itself in better impact performance. So it's a big question. It's a big challenge to solve, but the GSG is taking it up as a very important issue, and we will be working to try to implement some mechanisms now to improve the flow of capital to SMEs in emerging countries.
Yeah. You have a short follow-up? All right. So,
있으세요?
yeah. 지금 Tendai has a short follow-up question to you. Very short.
Yes, very short. Thank you for your response, Sir Cohen. And all things being equal, I hope to meet you at this year's GSG in South Africa. I'm sure that it's going to be really, really exciting to hear more about how these new ideas are going to help boost SMEs and definitely boost African economies. Thank you so much for that.
잠깐 말씀을 드리면은 이제 아프리카의 에듀케이션 아웃컴 펀드라고 교육 성과가 나오면은 거기에 대해서 투자를 해주는, 그러니까 사후 투자를 해주는 그런 형태의 이 투자 메커니즘을 우리 코이카와 그다음에 지금 코헨경이 맡고 계신 GSG의 에듀케이션 아웃컴 펀드가 같이 이제 투자를 하기로 최근에 이제 협약을 맺었습니다. 그래서 우리 한국도 이제 아프리카에 가서 같이 이제 이런 일을 할 수 있는 기회가 생길 걸로 그렇게 보입니다. I was just mentioning about education outcome fund to be supported by Korea DFI recently.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for your help in achieving that.
Yes, sure. Now, let me move on to Dawn. Dawn is another university student here, majoring in business and also interest in social enterprises and economy. Yes.
네. 로널드 코헨 경께서는 투자가 자본주의에 열려인 만큼 임팩트를 위해선 임팩트 투자가 중요하다고 말씀하셨는데요. 그런데 지금은 임팩트 특정 기준이 아직 표준화되지 않았고 임팩트 가중 회계가 널리 도입되지 않은 시점에서 임팩트 투자자들이 임팩트 워싱을 당하지 않고 현명하게 투자할 수 있는 지표가 있을까요?
So Dawn's question is very important, I think. Now, with the issue of impact washing and with still limitations in impact measurement and impact weighted accounts initiatives is still something that we have to work on further. With all these constraints, what should impact investors do when they invest without 100% certainty on the transparencies and measurements? What if what are the real things that they can work on now?
So I think investors have to push companies to make impact disclosures in the same way that the Procter & Gamble shareholders meeting required the company to deliver information about deforestation. So to the extent that companies begin to measure their impacts, they will begin to manage them. And I don't think it's going to be long before we have the publication of impact statements. I think it'll happen in the next 3 to 5 years that show revenues, costs, and 3 major elements of impact. Environmental impact from operations, in monetary terms, employment impact from employment practices in monetary terms, product impact from both an environmental and a social point of view, effects on the environment, but effects on health, for example, and actually a fourth one, which is supply chain impact. I think we are only 3 to 5 years away from that. And because we can see that this information is stock price sensitive already, we see regulators pressuring for the creation of the Sustainability Standards Board. And the next step is going to be pressure for the valuation of impacts and the publication of impact statements. The way to get there sooner is for investors to keep asking for more data about impacts from companies.
Yeah, thank you, Sir Ronnie, for the answer. 이제 임팩트 기업이 환경과 그다음에 기업의
마이크 키세요.
예. 들리십니까? 예.
네.
기업이 환경에 미치는 영향, 그리고 기업이 제품을 통해서 고객들에게 미치는 영향, 그렇죠? 그다음에 기업이 직원을 고용하면서 나오는 직원들에 대한 영향, 그리고 서플라이 체인, 즉 공급 업체들에 미치는 영향. 이런 영역들에 대해서 임팩트를 어떻게 측정할 것인가에 대해서 지금 IFRS 국제 회계 기준에서 이제 이것을 법적으로 규제로서 측정해서 보고하라라는 지금 움직임이 일어나고 있는 거고요. 이 결론이 곧 나올 것이다라는 것이고, 두 번째로는 그것만으로 부족하고 거기에서 이 화폐 가치로 이러한 기업의 영향을 측정해서 회계 재무제표에 반영하는 노력. 이것도 지금 되고 있고 그것도 곧 가시화될 것이다 이런 말씀이시고요. 그런 과정에서 현재로서 투자자들은 우리 다은 학생이 물어본 질문이죠. 투자자들이 현재에서 뭘 할 수 있냐? 이건 결국 기업들에게 가서 투자 대상이 기업들에 가서 임팩트에 관한 데이터를 계속 요구를 할수록 우리가 빠르게 더 이러한 임팩트 투명성의 측정 지표의 체계화에 도달할 수 있을 것이다라는 그런 말씀입니다. 네, 감사하고요. 예, 우리 그 다음에 next, Sir Ronnie, have you met Sangdal in person or online? Sangdal is together with me reviewed your Korean version of the impact, and Sangdal will be happy to ask some questions for you.
Had you written the book Impact earlier, then I could have had easier time in teaching at the university, because I have a new textbook. My students are very crazy about this material. I'd like to know, when you begin to have a conviction that impact becomes a new keyword that will drive the changes to a revolution? It's a simple question.
Thank you, Sandal, and thank you so much, Sandal, for your efforts in translating the book. I'm very proud of it. As you can see, it's behind me on the shelf. And I hope it will be very helpful to people in Korea who have the ambition to bring impact into their lives and into the businesses with which they're involved. So the time when I realized that we were really dealing with something massive, a paradigm shift in our economic system, is really in 2013-14 through the work of the G8 Impact Investment Task Force. Because until then, we had been developing instruments, financial instruments like social impact bonds, financial organizations like Bridges Ventures and Big Society Capital and social finance that were able to help raise capital for those who wanted to improve lives or the planet. But with the G8 task force, when we had 200 people working across the G8 countries, feeding back their understanding of what was happening in each country, we realized that values were changing. The values of young people at the beginning, and then a much broader group of the population. We realized that financial flows, $13 billion of ESG at the time, today it's over 40 trillion, over 40 trillion now. Impact investment proper, where you measure the impact as well as having the intention, was non-existent virtually. Today it's over $2 trillion. And so we sensed then that this was the beginning of a mega trend, and that actually the world was shifting from risk return to risk return impact. And that's when we coined the phrase, the invisible heart of markets. So it's 7 or 8 years ago.
Thank you, Sir Ronnie. Yeah, I'm sure more Korean students now will read your book because now it's written in Korean. Now let's start our conversation with all the participants who are staying here online through Zoom and through YouTube channels. Now let's start with some Zoom participants. Is there anybody who wants to go first and asking question? You can turn on your speaker on Zoom and then ask questions. Now I have my colleague, Professor Park, accounting professor from Sungkyunkwan University, who is vice committee chair of G7 Korea Impact Alliances, which is a supporting organization for G7 Impact Task Force. Professor Park, do you have a question for Sir Ronald, please?
Yes. I'm really impressed by your very insightful presentation and Q&A session. As an accounting professor teaching financial accounting, cost accounting, and management accounting, I know some difference between financial reporting side and internal use of accounting information for decision making. So when we talk about this sustainability disclosure of information, I feel what we are going to disclose is somewhere between so-called external users perspective versus internal user perspective. What I'm saying is, when we prepare financial statement based on standard GAAP, general accepted accounting principle, actually we don't consider decision process that much. We just try to provide objective principle-based information, and the users, whether they are equity investor or bond executors or lenders or government. So, all different users use this standardized information for their own purpose. That's why so-called financial statement is called general purpose disclosure. Now, we are trying to disclose sustainability-related information for investors as first users, but we have to take into account different users as well, government, customers, and so on, all different stakeholders. So now we have to provide sustainability-related disclosure for all different stakeholders, right? We are not providing just one set of, numbers and description only for investors to be truly stakeholder perspective. So in that sense, it's also a challenge, I believe, right?
Yes.
So that's something I think we have to study more and take into account and actually deciding final value of those impact for all different stakeholders. So I think that's a little bit challenging question. I know it's not really something we can achieve in short run, but I think this is one of the big challenges we face in the long run.
Yeah. Now it is a challenge because we are measuring some externalities now, which aren't directly related to the internal operation of firms. But we are seeing that these externalities are affecting the valuation of firms already, even if they are not affecting their profitability directly. And so I think the world is converging, and this is going to accelerate, to saying investors need to have all relevant information for the valuation of firms. Not for the profitability of firms, but for the valuation of firms. And we will need to provide, through an evolving impact accounting system, initially perhaps just an impact statement that shows revenues, costs, and the different impacts I've been referring to in monetary terms. And subsequently, perhaps it will also spread to the balance sheet and to an accounting system, but it's taken us 90 years to develop a financial accounting system. It's going to take us a long time to develop a similarly sophisticated impact accounting system. But the objective has to be, as you set out, Professor Page, to give an objective measure of the social and environmental impacts created by companies, and let investors then draw correlations, as we've been doing at Harvard, between some of the impact that is created and the valuation of companies. So, for instance, in environmental impact, we already see a correlation in the value of a company and its degree of pollution in many sectors. That didn't exist before, right? We never had that before as a tool of financial analysis. That may then shift to saying, what is the future growth rate of a company that is performing better on pollution, likely to be relative to one that is performing less well? It's going to have to make investments. It may have to be regulated. It may have to pay taxation. It may not be able to attract talent. You know, there are going to be effects, and investors will each take their view about which company is more likely to succeed, and so on. When it comes to employment impact, we can see correlations coming out of the 2,600 companies' employment impact in monetary terms. You can all go to HBS, IWA, and look at this. There is a direct relationship between employment turnover, people leaving the company, and employment practices. The companies that perform better in terms of employment practices, pay better wages, have better diversity, more equal advancement, and so on, have higher retention of talent. Over time, we will see whether that retention of talent translates into valuation of companies. So we're moving into a situation now similar to the emergence of gap accounting, where previously, before 1933, every company could pick its own accounting practices, and there were no auditors to verify the numbers. And so companies, you know, put out whatever was in their interest to put out. And after the crash, investors began to realize they needed proper transparency on profit, and so that pushed the government to gap accounting and the use of auditors and the establishment of the SEC. As you know, I think we're in a similar position today. Some people are screaming impact accounting is impossible. They did so about gap. Impact accounting, if it turns out to be possible, will spell the end of American capitalism or capitalism everywhere in the world. That's what they said about gap also. And now what we need, and this is where you and your colleagues in academia, like Professor Moon and others, can be helpful. We need to develop the standardization of metrics, which the ISSB is doing now, quantities of carbon liters of water and so on, and also the valuation of impact. And if we can take that step, we lay the basis, we lay the foundation for impact accounting, and then financial analysis would take these numbers and incorporate them into PE ratios, Sharpe ratios, Sortino ratios, all the ratios that we use in financial analysis to assess the valuation of a firm. And it is this change in the valuation of the firm that is going to drive companies in the direction of impact.
Thank you, Sir Ronnie, so much for the detailed views on this. I was very...
This meeting is being recorded.
Yes, it is being recorded. 그러니까 우리 재무회계라는 게 우리 백 교수님이 이제 회계학 교수님이시고 하시지만 재무회계, 그러니까 파이낸셜 어카운팅이 제대로 자리 잡고 있는데 지금 수십 년이 이상 더 걸리고 100년이라는 사람도 있고요, 그죠? 예, 굉장히 시간이 많이 걸리고 있는데 이 과정에서 사실은 어떻게 수익을 인식하고 어떻게 비용을 인식하고 어떻게 보고를 하는가 이런 것들을 합의해가는 과정이 굉장히 지난하게 오래 걸렸는데, 그러니까 임팩트를 우리가 밸류를 어떻게 측정하고 어떻게 보고하는 이 방식에 대해서 합의하는 것도 지금은 불가능하다라고 생각하지만 어차피 될 것이다. 시간을 거쳐서. 그리고 이를
This meeting is being recorded.
시간이 걸리지만 될 것이고, 그 다음에 중요한 것이 지금 말씀하셨듯이 이 어떤 보고 이해관계자에 대한 영향 이런 것들을 보고하지만 결국에는 그것이 마니터리 밸류로 어카운팅 시스템 안에 반영돼서 그것이 회사의 가치를 인식하는, 회사의 가치를 표현하는 방식까지 이제 진화될 것이다라는 이런 말씀을 해주셨습니다. 네, 여기 지금 이제 올라온 질문을 한번 제가 보겠습니다. 샤호비딘 Dablotov, can you speak in through Zoom? Is that possible? Where are you, 샤호비딘? Can you speak?
Can you hear me?
Yes, please. So Ronnie, 샤호비딘 has a question for you.
Sure.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very grateful to Sir Ronald Cohen.
Can you introduce yourself briefly?
Sorry?
Can you introduce yourself briefly?
I was really impressed by reading your book, and I have some questions. Today, large number of population is understanding the sense of impact and paying attention when they're making decision to buy some products or services. But despite this fact, there is some layer of population which is who is indifferent to this, and it still makes available to have large growth rates by the companies who have no positive impacts. And what do you think what should be done as a policymakers side to prevent it, and would be the correct measure to setting some barriers to companies who has no positive impact in society and in the planet as a whole?
So we're seeing the governments begin to talk about carbon taxes. So we're beginning to see taxation coming into the picture. The law courts get into the picture with the legal decision against Shell that it must reduce its carbon emissions by 40% before the end of the decade. So I believe what you need now for this to become systemically the case, that consumers are aware of the impact of companies and a much greater number have access to that information, is transparency on the impacts of companies. And we are already beginning to see apps. In France, I think there are 15 million users of an app which gives you the carbon footprint of the companies whose products you're trying to buy in the supermarket, you know? So we're going to see apps coming in that enable consumers to make more discriminating choices. Now, you don't need 100% of consumers to shift away from a company to put pressure on a company. Even if it loses 10% of sales, a company is going to start worrying about changing its behavior. So I think transparency is the key, and the measurement has to be reliable enough that people trust it. It's an evolution. We can do things on the basis of public data, which is what Harvard has done, not necessarily verified data by companies, and and so on and so forth. But I think there's a process now which is unstoppable. And the key is for us to be asking questions about the impacts of companies and getting answers.
So, Ronnie, I have one question from the audience, and I think this is very interesting. Let me read this. I have a question on the practice of ESG into impact. What is the first step to transform from ESG to impact? So he or she is asking the causality or the relationship between ESG and impact, which comes first. Can you clarify or can you help us understand how impact is at the core of this whole ball game?
To create impact, but it doesn't measure it. Impact investment has both the intention and the measurement of impact. So as we bring impact transparency to companies, we turn ESG into impact investment. And that's what's in the process of happening now. You see in the newspapers and on television cases of investors complaining about the impact being delivered by the funds in which they invest. You see Bloomberg attacking MSCI for giving ratings around impact which are misleading about companies. Everything is going to push us now to more accurate impact measurements. And when you get that for publicly listed companies and for private companies, then every investment becomes an impact investment.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Derek Kim from Landmarker Ministry has another question. And he has some difficulty in differentiating between the concept of impact and the concept of externalities, and which I think is very important to clarify the difference. And how does measurement play a role in the demarcation of those two concepts? That's the question. Would you be able to help us understand, Sir Ronnie? Yes.
Impact is the effect that you have on people and planet. So it's externalities. Impact is about measuring the externalities that you create in the process of trying to deliver a profit. But it implies that you try to create positive effects. Impact investment is about positive impact. And so the measurement of the externalities you create when you're talking about the community, which is something we've never done before. What is the level of diversity of a company? How do you measure diversity in economic terms? We measure it at Harvard as the cost to that community of missed employment. demographics inside a company's facilities and outside, and we put, as I said earlier, I think we put salary levels to it, and that's the cost to the community. 16% of wages for Amazon, $6.5 billion diversity debit. These are externalities we were never aware of. The externalities we're aware of now, like CO2 emissions, are beginning to be talked about, and the point that Professor Paik was raising was some of these externalities don't immediately affect the profitability of the company. So the level of CO2 emissions of a company doesn't affect its profitability. If it was pushing effluent into a river and it got taxed for it or fined for it or prevented from doing it, or if it has a product like we saw with the pharmaceutical industry, which is addictive, then these externalities eventually catch up with you, and you know, billions of dollars are paid in, in fines. So there is a broader sense now of how some externalities that don't immediately affect the profitability of a company affect its value. If a company, take ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil has an environmental footprint, so it creates from its operations environmental damage of $39 billion a year. That compares with 23 billion for Shell and 14 billion for British Petroleum, for BP, right? So the board of ExxonMobil is saying, these externalities don't matter to me. And that's what they said. We're continuing with fossil fuels. What happened? The share price of ExxonMobil fell by 2/3 in 3 years, and there was a shareholder revolt. Okay? So the externalities are beginning to affect the values of companies now. And so think of it as we must measure every externality that's material to the valuation of a company.
Thank you, Sir Ronnie, for great question. 자, 마지막으로 질문 하나 더 받겠습니다. 네. 혹시 또 질문 있으십니까? Yeah. I have a question from my colleague in Korea NAB, Joshua Lim, and he has a very salient question to me. So let me introduce Joshua. And I think you met Joshua when you were in South Korea 4 years back.
Hello, Joshua.
Yeah. Hi. I don't know how. So whether you remember me or not. My short question is, to move the whole world to sustainability, the valuation paradigm of the mainstream capital market should be changed. What will be the most important driving factor to make such valuation transition? More than delivering clear and more impact data to the mainstream investors seems to be needed.
We have to get to standardized information that makes it possible to compare, and that's why a single unit of measurement is necessary, and currency is the obvious one, a social impact with an environmental impact with profit. So the lever we need to shift our economic system is finance. The fulcrum on which the lever rests has to be standardized metrics and valuation of impacts reflected in the financial accounts and additional impact statement of companies. If we can get to that, we will see our paradigm shift.
Thank you.
It's shifting already, but that, to answer your question, is the major lever to shift it completely.
Thank you.
네, 표준화하고 나중에 가서는 이제 화폐 가치로 변환해서 가장 쉽게 직관적으로 이해할 수 있는 화폐 가치로 변환시켜서 표준화하는 임팩트를 측정하는 방식이 지금 우리 임창규 전무님께서 질문해 주시는 그럼 어떻게 임팩트 투자를 새로운 이 회사 가치를 평가하는 패러다임 변화를 반영하는 방식으로 바뀌는 그런 과정에서 반영할 수 있는가? 임팩트 측정의 표준화라고 보십니다. So Ronnie, thank you so much for your great time and all these insights. These are so much helpful for all the audiences in Korea today, I believe. And we hope to get together again with you sometime. Well, hopefully in person as Omicron comes down a little better. And on behalf of Korea ecosystem, we truly appreciate. Yes. Thank you so much, Sir Ronnie.
And all of our colleagues on the NAB, keep up the good work. All of you, young entrepreneurs and students, we're relying on you to lead this impact revolution. Goodbye.
Let's give big hand to Sir Ronnie. Thank you. Thank you so much. 오늘 온라인으로 참석해 주시고 또 책을 읽어 주신 여러분들 감사하고요. 우리 Sir Ronald Cohen이 특별히 학생분들에게는 이 책을 무료로 이북 형태로 드리겠다고 합니다. 그래서 여러분들 이 출판사에 어떻게 링크로 들어가서 이북을 받는가 하는 부분이 있으니까 저희가 추가로 안내를 드리겠습니다. 오늘 늦은 시간까지 같이 해주셔서 너무 감사하고요. 오늘 NAB가 주관하는 임팩트 북콘서트 이것으로 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다, 여러분. Thank you so much for joining us.
감사합니다.